Hello and welcome to The Print. This is Nikhil Rampal, Senior Correspondent at The Print's Political Economy Bureau, and you're watching Page Turner. Joining us in this episode, we have today with us Nilakantan RS, who is the Chief Data Scientist at Ideas to IT, a fintech startup based in Chennai. Nilakantan has a keen interest in writing about issues pertaining to public policy and political economy. Using publicly available data, he has recently written a book titled South versus North, India's Great Divide. His book statistically establishes how the southern peninsular India is wealthier, healthier, and more prosperous on other development outcomes than India on average. What makes this distinction between North and South clear, and what lessons can the humble North learn from the richer South? We will try to find out in this conversation. Hello, Mr. Nilakantan. Thank you so much for your time and welcome to The Print.
Hello, Nikhil. Nice being with you.
So my first question to you is, we know that South Indian states usually have a higher per capita income and are more urbanized. The government's All India Debt and Investments Survey of 2019 shows that barring Kerala, the remaining four southern Indian states exhibit high level of inequalities in urban areas. What exactly is prosperity without equality?
That's a good question to ask, right? It is a sad fact of the way in which economic growth happens in this country, that economic growth is kind of dependent upon urbanization and moving away from what used to be the rural economy. And as we move into cities, there is inequality, and the reason for that inequality is complex and complicated, and that would be an entirely different book in and of itself. But the simple fact is that urbanized places end up experiencing higher inequality.
And what do you think about it? Like, what exactly would be needed to solve it?
Like I said, that would probably be an entirely different conversation. But what I would say is that, what we need is for the government services in terms of health, in terms of education, in terms of basic support services, to put a reasonably good floor under the, under people, so that people do not feel the threat of destitution, so that they can go and live their best life, so to speak, right? Like the kind of interventions that a government needs to do in order for reducing inequality in that sense, in the Indian context at least, the state governments have very little sort of leeway to do that, right? Like what they can do, which the southern states have done to a limited extent, is to put a firm floor under the feet of people. However, the structural inequality that is perpetuated in the modern capitalist order is kind of beyond the scope of what state governments can achieve or can equalize.
All right. So my next question is that you wrote how the National Eligibility Entrance Test, the NEET, has distorted the southern India's capacity to produce doctors for its future. Can you cite more examples as to how a one pill that fits all has disrupted South India's capabilities to prosper?
So almost in every single policy area, right? And that is the primary thesis of the book. If you look at any of the metrics in health, in education, in economy, what happens is that, India is a vastly diverse country. So, if you take education, for instance, and let's, the NEET is at the level of an entrance examination to become a doctor, right? But for much earlier, the National Education Policy of 2020 lays out they want to do that. The vision of that document is to have a similar sort of a standardized test even for general, like all kinds of colleges, right? Now, the problem, and they also want to have like, how do I say this? Like what is the equivalent of a public exam, but not quite, in that they want a standardized testing, like they do in the United States under what was called No Child Left Behind, right? So they want standardized testing across, the various school grades. Now, the problem with that, when you have such a vision, is as follows. For instance, if you take states like Tamil Nadu and Kerala, in Tamil Nadu, the gross enrollment ratio of kids in who are higher secondary education is about 84%. In Kerala, it's about 80%, right?
Yeah.
Now, the, the the problem is that, if you administer those in these states, it's probably all right. But if you administer this in states in the Indo-Gangetic plains, which are way lower, right? Not enough kids go to school and stay in school in the first place. We also know that one of the biggest reasons why children drop out of school is a fear of examinations, failure, all of these things combined, right? Now, the simple question here is, would you rather, in a state which already suffers from serious dropout rates, rather have the child drop out or rather have the child stay in school, even if that child were to quote unquote fail that particular test, right? Like a reasonable person would say, let children stay in school regardless of, how much they learn, because that's an important thing in and of itself. Especially in states where the gross enrollment ratio for higher secondary is like, less than sometimes less than 60%, right? Whereas in Tamil Nadu's case, it's like upwards of 84%. And so it can probably afford to do that, right? So in other words, there are states where the output metric, which is the quality of education, which is primarily, gauged by testing such as this, needs to be the focus. There are states where the input metric, that is how many children do we have in school in the first place, needs to be the metric. And this, if you have a one-size-fits-all policy, is going to be terrible because there is such large divergence across these states. So what is good for Uttar Pradesh is terrible for, Tamil Nadu and vice versa, right? And therefore, in such a scenario, what you want is, and this is why we elect state governments, like voters in Tamil Nadu hopefully elect their state government with the hope that, their state makes these difficult choices. It's not a good decision for any state to basically say that, we are going to let children not keep children in school, right? That's a difficult decision to make. And likewise, when you do not have enough children in school in the first place, it takes a lot of effort, which Tamil Nadu, Kerala, Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, all of these did with midday meals to sort of get children into school in the first place, right? Like Uttar Pradesh needs to figure out, or Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, all these states need to figure out ways to get children into school in the first place, right? So the focus on input metrics versus output metrics, and depending, and that is again not just a monolith, it's not a binary, right? Like there are within those states across the Indo-Gangetic plain, there are variances, and within these states in the southern peninsula, there are variances, right? And therefore, each state needs to come up with its own kind of a policy, which the electorate thinks is a moral thing to do in the first place, is what that particular state government needs to do. And that's why we elect state governments, right?
Yep. So, this was all about education. NEET is also part of education. Beyond education, do you think there has been something that in which one size that fits all has disrupted the South India's capacities?
Absolutely, right? Like education is just one example. Take health, for instance. For quite a while, we've been running quite recently. And this is the tragedy of these usurpation by the union government, right? There is a program for curbing maternal mortality, and it's called Matru something, and I can't pronounce the Hindi word, right? So, and it actually begins there, right? Which is that the union government sort of takes up these policies, sort of gives it Orwellian names, and this is not just true for this particular union government, right? This has been happening for a very long time. They give it Orwellian names, and then what happens is that sometimes they used to be run as successful state governments in one state or another, and then they sort of take that up, maternal mortality, infant mortality, and you take these two, for instance, right? Like the infant mortality of Kerala is like, and Tamil Nadu for that matter, and Kerala in particular is comparable to the United States. Tamil Nadu is comparable to middle and upper middle income countries, whereas those in the Indo-Gangetic plains, they're comparable to sub-Saharan Africa, right? Now, if you want to have a single program, again, for improving infant mortality rates or maternal mortality rates or under 5 mortality rates or improving the vaccination rates of children or getting early childhood nutrition services to any of these states. The difference is as stark as one between OECD countries and sub-Saharan Africa. Again, it's a question of input versus output, right? Like in Kerala, it can afford to do a lot of things because it does not, the threat of more children dying is actually quite less. And therefore, you can tailor your programs towards that. Whereas in Uttar Pradesh, if you do something, the threat is that like probably another 1,000, 10,000 children will die. Like who wants that on their hands, right? And therefore, the idea of any of these programs being run from Delhi is deeply, deeply problematic. Yet, all of these states actually sign on to that simply because which state in southern India wants to let go of such large sums of money which come in through these, through these
Centrally
central
sponsored schemes. Yes.
and states' ability to raise revenues have been so dramatically cut down that unless they actually get this and do, implement these in the way in which the central government has designed, they sort of will get no funds and therefore will have nothing to do. So it's sort of, it's almost like, I do not want a loan, but I get it anyway because I don't want to pay taxes or some weird version of that, right? Like it's that.
Okay, so coming to the next question, you've written about how the 15th Finance Commission disincentivizes population control by adding the 2011 population while transferring the finances to the states. Though the government claims it has incentivized population control by giving 12.5 percentage weightage to 1971 population as well, what do you think could have been a better alternative to reach some sort of an equilibrium?
Right. So the government did say that, right? Like when the original terms of reference came in, all of us made a lot of noise because of which the government basically said they will introduce what is population performance as a factor, right? And then the noise died down because the government in its wisdom basically said that. But and then if you look at the Finance Commission report, in the actual report itself, it basically says that it is taking into account, what is population performance. So far, so good, except you have to go to the appendix and read it, right? If you read the appendix, what it has done is it has scaled every single factor that there is, including the population performance itself with the population of 2011, right? Which means that for the population performance as a factor in the 15th Finance Commission's overall formula, it has scaled that particular variable with the population of that is, which is basically the fertility rate is what they count as a population performance. They've scaled that factor with the population of 2011. So the net effect of that variable is that if you take that, and I sort of talk about this in the book in some detail, which is that if you take that population performance factor alone and you do a simple correlation analysis, it is actually correlated greater to the population of 2011 than it is to the TFR, which it is supposed to represent, right? So it's a kind of like, I don't know, like, did they think that people are stupid enough to not read appendix? I don't know what it is, but it is deeply troubling that, serious people in the government sort of take this approach wherein they hide problematic ideas in the appendix.
So what do you think could have been the equilibrium? The government says that we have to, like we cannot let go of so many people of the finances that they should be getting from like in public services from Act. So what do you think could have been a better alternative that served the present day population of these states, as well as incentivizing the states which did better on controlling the population?
So that is a serious problem, right? There are no easy answers to that particular question, right? Like, so let's consider the populous states of Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, etc., right? And let's consider and Rajasthan, for instance. So the state in the last 40 years, from the 1971 census to the 2011 census, if you consider, Rajasthan is the state with the highest population growth, right? And Kerala is the state with the least population growth. And the next greatest. So if you consider these two states, what it is, how do I say this? It is not a fair system to basically tell somebody in Rajasthan that we will not extend sufficient government services to you because you belong to a state which essentially has, grown in population over and beyond what the population policy had forecast or demand or set as targets for you, right? That's fair. The other end of the spectrum is Kerala, which actually did everything that the union government asked for it in the 70s, and now is being asked to pay more in tax and get less in return of that tax money. Just as the first situation is unfair in some world, the second situation is even more unfair, right? Now, at least in the first situation, you could argue that a society which sort of, grows in exponential manner, like Rajasthan has, like Bihar has, like Uttar Pradesh has, like Chhattisgarh has, like all states in the Indo-Gangetic Plains have, like it's of their own doing is a argument to make, which is it's problematic in and of itself, but at least it's an argument that we recognize, which is that there are actions and there are consequences, right? Now, what how do you explain this to Kerala, which is that it did everything that it was asked of it and went over and beyond that, and it is punished for that success, right? Which is now to your question of what you do here, right? What you do, whatever you do here is going to have serious questions, and basically people in Kerala need to ask themselves, how much are we willing to give to Rajasthan, right? Over and beyond our own basic services of government, right? And the democratic answer to that in states like Kerala, and states like Tamil Nadu, and states like Telangana, like the citizens of those states need to seriously, the union government or needs to convince them that them paying taxes and not getting enough in return is actually worth the investment. And if you are going to do that, the corollary is they would basically turn back and ask, okay, if that is the case, do we have a certain, like, how do I say, the say in the policy of those states? They don't. Right? In fact, it is happening in the reverse, which is that the policies set for the Indo-Gangetic Plains are actually getting implemented in these states, right? So and that therein lies the fundamental sort of divergence that is unsolvable in the present system in India, and which is why in the last third of the book I proposed some alternative solutions.
So, I mean, coming to that, so what will you recommend to the next Finance Commission, which draws all the devolution formulae while taking the population into consideration? What will you ask them? What will you suggest them that please do this so that you're being kinder or fair to the southern Indian states?
The easiest thing to do would be for the union government to stop spending on what are essentially state subjects, right? Stop doing that, right? Like, so taxation works as a virtuous thing. If, like, I assume you live in Delhi, and when you pay taxes to the government and you see government services being extended to citizens around you, you sort of see your tax money being put to use, so that you sort of have that bond with that society, saying that my money is being collected from me and being used for my people, and this is my society, right? There's that virtuous cycle that is built, right? In the best case scenario of taxation, right? In the worst case scenario of taxation, that doesn't happen, but like, let's assume the best case for now, right? Now, when that happens, good, right? If you don't have that, and instead money comes from somewhere else, which is what happens in many of these Indo-Gangetic plains, neither are local sort of sufficiently invested in terms of that virtuous cycle, nor is the government sort of seriously thinking about its ability to raise its own revenue, right? So there's that serious disconnect. Money comes from somewhere else, it gets spent. The people from somewhere else do not have a say in how that money is spent. The people locally are sort of bypassed, be it in Rajasthan or in Kerala or in Tamil Nadu. Somebody who's sitting in Delhi actually decides policy for these people. So the essential element of belonging that citizens ought to have, both in terms of policy making and in terms of their taxation, which is kind of a sacrifice, that is cut. And when that is cut, you are going to have these problems.
So you think that if the government stops funding the centrally sponsored schemes, that can reduce?
The government needs to sort of reverse and roll back its extensive usurpation of states' rights. Right? The union government needs to do that as step one. Step two, that is not sufficient. Step two is that if you do that, then a lot of states will sort of at least do better in terms of what they can and cannot do. Once you have done that, you probably have to set a floor in terms of how much can flow out of a state and a ceiling in terms of how much something can flow into the state, right? So that, the better performing prosperous states aren't an endless sort of war chest that you can keep raiding. And, the states that receive aren't an endless pit where you just throw money in, right? Like, so there needs to be a balance of a lower floor and an upper ceiling for both these states. If that is not the case, a useful way to do that was what we used to have before the 13th Finance Commission, which is that fix it at 1971, right? If you fix it at 1971, it did act in some way, shape, or form as, this floor plus ceiling, simply because the northern parts of the country, that is the Indo-Gangetic plains, have historically been like, had higher populations, right? It's just that they've grown even further now, but, this floor and ceiling would automatically be taken care of at 1971 level. So it's a reasonable compromise.
Okay, that brings me to the next question. Now, your book mentions that Karnataka is an outlier among the southern Indian states when it comes to retaining kids for higher secondary education. Now, despite being one of the biggest job providers in the service sector, what do you think is pulling the state down in this regard?
So, gross enrollment ratio from where Karnataka sort of has a problem is retaining kids from high, sort of, in middle school to high school, right? Like that's where sort of, children drop off in Karnataka. Now, what is causing that? Because Karnataka actually does a very good job of, having midday meals extended to all its kids, which is probably the reason why there's very high enrollment until middle school levels, right? From middle school, there is like a dramatic dropout in Karnataka, unlike its other southern peers. Now, why this is happening? There are complicated reasons why this happens, right? Social tensions often result in one, girls sort of not having sufficient, the book also shows that, right? Like menstrual hygiene, presence of a toilet in a school, general safety, or perception of safety, right? Like police presence in the streets. All of these actually attribute to higher gross enrollment ratio of girls in school, right? Now, which of these is causing Karnataka to sort of lose that little bit of kids staying on to high school from middle school? It's not clear, but they need to work on all of these things, right? And it does not help that on top of all of these things, the few girls who are in school, you tell them you can or cannot wear this piece of clothing. It's only going to sort of make matters which are already sort of, dicey. Of course, Karnataka is doing better than, most states in the Indo-Gangetic plains, but it wants to do as well as Tamil Nadu or Kerala. It doesn't want to compare itself to its northern, peers, right? And if it wants to do that, it really wants to eliminate any and every single obstacle that there are for girls to get into school.
Okay, so my next question to you is, what do you think that the Northern India can learn from the South India's experience of moving from agro economies to industrialized ones? What does it take to reach that level that the populous states have not been able to do so far?
So, it is not as if, somebody had a policy, Tamil Nadu, for instance, is the most urbanized state and has the most number of factories, and therefore sort of has the least people dependent on subsistence farming, as the data shows, right? Now, this did not happen because the state government decided this to be a goal and, set policies towards motion. All it did was, it basically had a midday meal scheme and it sent kids to school. And all those kids went to school and, like 84% of them basically graduate high school, according to current data. And over 50% of them go to college of some sort, right? If you have such high education, because how unremunerative agriculture is in this country, most of those kids are basically not going to do agriculture. They have to do something outside, and given that they are reasonably educated, they're going to do either, hold a job in a factory, given that, there are these many factories, some of them will probably start factories and some of them will go into reasonably high-end services, right? So it is an accident and a pleasant accident of what was the wonderful idea of a midday meal scheme. Right? It's not a conscious policy decision of, okay, we need to move people away from subsistence farming.
So, do you think that the present midday meal scheme that is being run across the country, will it help move people from agrarian economies to move, I mean, to become
The
a
answer, the answer is probably a no, because the midday meal scheme worked in its time, right? And the I'm not even that old, and I remember there used, when I was a child, there were instances where a lot of kids would go to school simply because they wanted to eat, not because they wanted to study, right? I don't, I've not gone to, Eastern Uttar Pradesh or Bihar, where the data shows that there is extensive poverty and whether kids do that still today. But in Tamil Nadu, that situation is gone. And in many of the places that I have been to in India, at least anecdotally, I have not seen that. So why kids drop out of school and the kinds of incentives that are needed in much of the Indo-Gangetic plains to have kids come into school are probably very different from what the midday meal scheme was like half a century ago, right? So we need to think about what will work today. Just copying something from 50 years ago from a different state is just not going to work.
Maybe we can call it another example of how one size that doesn't fit all.
Exactly, exactly, right?
So this brings to my concluding question, right? Now, Bangalore was recently cited as the least livable city in India for its infrastructure, of course, and Hyderabad doesn't make it to the top of livable cities in India either. Barring Chennai, which are the South Indian cities do you think have the potential that can pull crowds the way Delhi and Bombay do?
So so the reason why Delhi NCR works as a city has, those are complicated reasons, right? It's not because of the historical, the historical city of Delhi has very little to do with why the modern city of Delhi sort of pulls a lot of people in, right? So, for instance, Cochin is a great city. Trivandrum is a great city. I really enjoyed living in Hyderabad for about 9 months. But all cities, the reason why cities exist and the reason why they have a certain, cities wane and prosper in cycles, right? And that often depends upon various global factors, right? Now, if you ask anybody on the streets of Madras in a certain neighborhood, they'll very easily tell you that, oh, that Yale University, yeah, we funded it, right? Like and there is that essential idea of Madras always having been like a city that was a great place in the 18th century and then like has always been on a downward spiral, right? Like, so why cities have that pull and at what point in time is a complicated question to answer. But what we need to make of cities is to make them, livable and make them liberal enough so that enough people come there and make it their home and, things.
So which ones do you think still have the potential that, okay, if not Bangalore, if not Hyderabad, these are the cities people can think of moving to because they offer better livability maybe, or they can be grown better, because you understand, like, this is southern India, it's a huge peninsular region, and if it's not drawing crowds, if it's not having population, if it's not having cities with 10 million.
Okay, so if the assumption here from the book that you get is that there aren't like, how do I say this? If you go out to the streets of any of these cities that you mentioned,
Yeah.
it's not as if we've run out of people, right? We've not. Okay, it's so we need to be South India has not had such a population explosion as Northern India has. Yes. That is not to say that we are running out of people. We are still a very, very densely populated part of the world, and we have enough and more people to do whatever it is that we want to do.
So right? Is this population explosion one of the factors why the city planners, or maybe the development of the towns was done in such a haphazard way that they become less livable than the historic towns?
Again, urban planners have written multiple books on this topic, right? Like it would be terribly immodest of me to answer, but however, the point is that the way in which migration works in India and the way in which, the subsistence farming is sort of, putting farmers in cycles of debt, and therefore there's hordes of migration to these cities is something that not enough, unless you build new cities or you basically decide you're going to, I don't know, have outstanding public infrastructure like what certain Chinese cities do. It's very difficult for you to sort of do anything about it, right? And we do not have either the capacity of the state that the Chinese government has, nor do we have the power of the state that the Chinese government has, simply because it can just make people disappear. So what is the good answer there? I don't know the answer to that question.
All right. I hope in this conversation, Mr. Nilakantan tried his best to answer about the great North-South divide in India. With this, we end this episode of Page Turner. Stay tuned to the print.in.